when Russia invaded Ukraine, that was a disaster for the Russian people, disaster for the Ukrainian people, disaster for us people, working classes all around the world. But the transnational capitalist class didn't look at it like that. They looked at it and said, incredible, this is just what we want. All over the world, war, conflict, repression are becoming privatized and profitable, and they're sustaining a global economy which is mired in stagnation. So increasingly, Palestinians become what I call surplus humanity, meaning that capital does not need to exploit their labor. They're just redundant, surplus. You just have to get rid of them. And so really the genocide against the Palestinians of Gaza is surplus humanity, serves no use for global capitalism. And Israel is doing the dirty work of global capitalism by trying to get rid of the Gazan population and then move into there. There's oil, there's gas, there's beachfront property, but there's also clean up the area for a gateway for transnational capitalist expansion in the Middle East. What we have to see with immigrant labor, because it's so revealing to the global police state, is that repressing and persecuting immigrant labor is enormously profitable for an increasingly big and hegemonic block of capital, which is the hegemonic block of capital at this time, which brings together the giant tech corporations with the military-industrial complex with transnational finance. The three of them come together for this new hegemonic block of capital. Core Civic, that used to be called Corrections Corporation of America, drafted legislation called SB State Bill 1070 and said to the governor, I forgot her full name, and the governor's lieutenant governor of Arizona, please take this piece of legislation, which is calling for the criminalization of immigrants, of undocumented immigrants, and a massive campaign against them. Take this back to Arizona and have it passed. They brought it back. Now, of course, both of those people, the governor and lieutenant governor, they were shareholders of Corrections Corporation of America. They passed that legislation. That sparked massive protest all over the United States, but it also marked a qualitative new stage in the war against immigrants, where we see crystal clear, how waging the war against immigrants is enormously profitable for capital at a time of stagnation in the global economy, declining rates of profit. Other countries around the world said, this is great. We should create these mega prisons. And Sri Lanka announced one which is going to hold 60,000. Thailand, China, Turkey, Egypt, all over the world, governments started announcing they're going to make the mega prisons after the Salvadoran model. So the second strategy that the ruling groups have to contain and control surplus humanity is the Salvadoran option, mass incarceration. And that also becomes profitable as part of militarized accumulation by repression. I mean, the image of an industrial worker making $40, $50 an hour and having a home and also a boat and all of these benefits, that's a bygone era. The vast majority of workers, they are citizen workers in the United States already, pulverized. This system is so internally contradictory, it's going to collapse in on its own weight. Of course, it's going to take humanity down with it if we let it.
Well, good morning or good evening to everyone, depending on your time zone. We're here with William Robinson. Normally, we ask our guests to just give a brief introduction to viewers so that they know a little bit about you, where they can find your work, etc.
So, yes, I'm William Robinson. I'm a distinguished professor of sociology, global studies, and Latin American studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. I do have a professional webpage through the university. I don't have it in front of me, but if you were to go to University of California, Santa Barbara, then go to the sociology department, then look at faculty, it will have a link to my webpage. I also have an Amazon book page on William I. Robinson. You need to use my middle initial. And I'll just add also, I wasn't always an academic. In my previous career and previous life, I was a journalist, and I was also activist and lived in and went through the Nicaraguan, the Sandinista revolution of the 1980s. I came into academia in the decade later.
And that actually brings us a bit to why we wanted to interview you today, William. And you write a lot of interesting stuff on your website, and you recently wrote a very interesting piece, and I will link to it in the description for those of the viewers who want to see it. And you talk about something called the third worldization of our working class, and you link that also to the crackdown by Donald Trump on the migrants. We have this almost going Trump almost going full Nazi, you could say,
Yeah.
on
Mhm.
immigrants with ICE. I mean, it's very scary to see. Can you tell us a bit how these things are linked, and why do you call that the third worldization of the working class?
Sure. Yeah, great question, and there's a lot to discuss here. But let's start. Um, let's start with this: that there's there's a mistaken view that in what we used to call the first world, now we call the global north, that or more sociological terms, the core and things for the periphery, that workers had high living standards for the last 500 and some odd years of world capitalism, and that's absolutely not true. I mean, workers in what we're now referring to as the West or the rich countries lived absolutely immiserated, super exploited lives, just like workers and poor people and exploited people all over the world, really until the earliest that starts changing is the late 1800s. It's the 1900s, that is the 20th century, when there are mass struggles. Of course, there's mass struggles worldwide, all over the world, but several waves of struggle in, let's take the case of the United States, that really forced the system to redistribute wealth downward and to regulate capital in the centers of world capitalism, United States, Western Europe, especially Japan. And so many workers, their living standards rose. But that was a momentary bleep in the screen of global capitalism. That was a temporary phenomenon. And what happened is you have rising living standards in post World War II and the golden years of capitalism in the course of world capitalism in the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s into the 70s. There's a lot of affluence among workers, and that's why there's also a lot of conservatism among first world workers during this time. So, but capital always has one drive, and that is to maximize profit, to extract all of the surplus value, all of the surplus labor it can get out of the toiling masses, the working masses. And so there's a big crisis of world capitalism in the 1970s. That's the previous crisis. Now we're in a new incredible crisis of global capitalism. And the turning point for that is 2008, the global financial collapse, compounded by the COVID collapse and everything going on now. But let's go back to that crisis of the 1970s. The capitalist class in the United States had never wanted to have an affluent working class. That's not good for capital. And the struggle between capital and labor is a zero-sum struggle. And so capital took advantage of the crisis in the 1970s, especially, again, the United States, the headquarters of world capitalism at the time, to go global, to launch globalization, and to launch an all-out attack on the U.S., but also on the U.S. working class, but also on workers and the exploited classes all over the world from the 1970s and on. We can call that capitalist globalization. That's the terminology I use. It's also the era of neoliberalism. And so the working class in the United States begins this or goes back to a situation where it's being socioeconomically destabilized, experiencing downward mobility. In fact, wages in the United States have been stagnant since the late 1970s. And so these attacks have continued against the working class in the United States as part of the worldwide offensive of transnational capital against the oppressed and the exploited. But how does this link to migration? And let's look at this. So one of the new axes of inequality worldwide is dividing the global working class into citizen and immigrant labor. And what the bonanza for capital to have immigrant labor, and again, let's use the example of the United States, can be super exploited and super controlled. If you're not legally in a country, you can't defend your labor rights, your political rights, your civil rights. You can't vote in elections, and so you're very vulnerable. You have to live semi-underground. And so that's conditions in which capital employers can super exploit labor, super control labor, and threaten you with deportation. But that's always been a very contradictory system. Very contradictory. And so this war against immigrants, this incredible repression against immigrants, this surge of hyper-nationalism and nativism and so forth, that all of these have to be now linked to the crisis that global capitalism faces now. And one thing that the U.S. state needs to do, as do all states, is to figure out how to externalize the social tensions, how to externalize the mass social anxiety generated by the conflict, the insecurity over the future, the increasing precariousness of the vast majority of people, increasing, escalating inequality. What do you do with all of that tension built up, because it will explode, boiling against the system itself? So you have to divert it. You have to channel it elsewhere. You have to come up with scapegoats. And so really there's two ways that this crisis is being externalized by the US state, by Trumpism, and before Trumpism. It's just fully blown up with Trumpism. One is that immigrants are the scapegoat now. And so there's this massive anti-immigrant hysteria whipped up by the ruling groups here. And then the other thing is, of course, you externalize all of that tension by finding external enemies. China, for instance. But so how does this link that one sector of the ruling class has always said we need to repress immigrants and we really don't want immigrants, and the way we're going to build a social base is to promote nativism and xenophobia. And so that's a big, significant portion of Trump's social base is this racism against immigrants, this nativism against immigrants. But there's something else going on. I know this is a long-winded response, but it's sort of the big picture. And in the article you mentioned, the third worldization of the working class, that I started that article by quoting Rollins. Rollins is the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, and she was asked at this press conference in Washington D.C., "Are you going to pull back a little bit on these ICE attacks, this ICE terrorism?" Because I'm in Los Angeles, and I know that Peter, you know California because you studied at a UC, so right up the road from Los Angeles is. Are the big agricultural fields of Oxnard and Ventura and Camarillo. And so there was a raid there in which a man was killed. He tried to get away by jumping on a roof, just run away. This old man had been an agricultural farm worker all his life. And so there was a real attack on agricultural workers. And so they asked the secretary, "Are you going to continue these ICE attacks on agricultural workers?" And she said, "Absolutely. The deportations are going to completely continue." But then she added, but the real solution here, first of all, is going to come from automation, and we need to talk about that later in the interview. That's very important. And meanwhile, it's also going to come because citizens, U.S. people in the United States, need to take those jobs that immigrants are doing. We're going to deport the immigrants, and U.S. citizens have to take those jobs. Now, what did she not say is that was linked to this budget bill that Trump had passed, that the Republicans had passed. And the budget bill cut billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions actually, over the next few years, trillions of dollars from social spending. That's like an incredible intensification of neoliberalism, and of course, so it's estimated that 15 to 20 million people are going to lose their medical coverage, their public Medicaid coverage, and they're really desperate, and also Social Security or pensions are being threatened. So what she was saying is, if those people that are going to lose their medical coverage, if they want to retain that coverage, they better go and take these incredibly low-paid, miserating jobs that immigrants are doing, because immigrants are concentrated in the low ends of construction, agricultural labor, day laborers, and so forth. So this is a whole scheme to have your scapegoat to try and stabilize an emerging fascist social order, but also to absolutely immiserate and pulverize the citizen working class. I mean, the whole working class, but the citizen elements of the working class. So really, the war on immigrants is a war against the working class, waged in new and more dangerous and more vicious and more really neo-fascist ways. A long answer, and we still can unpack a whole lot of that.
No problem. No problem. You can answer as long as you'd like. So I have a quick question, and then I'm going to hand it to Peter. So what is the advantage of having you could say national citizens of the United States take over these jobs of immigrants? Why can we not keep it like that? For example, that the immigrants are doing the lowest paid jobs, and you have a national citizenry that has a bit of a slightly more advantageous position, you could say, as a working class. What is the benefit of shifting this now, the local citizenry, to those kind of low end jobs, so to speak?
Right. Well, the advantage for capital is that it weakens labor all around. It weakens labor all around. Right now, you have a situation where you have 12 to 15 million undocumented immigrants, or immigrants that, even if they're documented, if you don't continue in your work, you can be deported. And then you have citizen labor, which has a little bit of advantage, but really not much. I mean, it's not to the benefit and that's actually the other flip side of this is that there's been a complete immiseration of citizen workers. I mean, the image of an industrial worker making $40, $50 an hour and having a home and also a boat and all of these benefits, that's a bygone era. The vast majority of workers, they are citizen workers in the United States already, pulverized, increasing precarious. I mean, the data here is that 80% of U.S. families have no more than $400 savings account. And so if they lose their job, they can lose their house. I don't have the data right in front of me, but there was the last 2-3 years there's a giant increase, like a 47% increase in poverty, a 40% increase in hunger and malnutrition. Increasingly, families not only have to have both. If there's two heads of households, both working, but both working two jobs, and so again, these are conjunctions that come together. On the one hand, the capitalists could say, well, citizen workers will continue to, their situation will continue to deteriorate, and immigrant workers, we can continue to super exploit them. That's one position. The other position is, how do we stabilize this situation, and how do we channel all of this mass outrage at the system externally? But then there's also something else going on. Without trying to complicate this, the capitalist class, but also their representatives in the state, the political elite that run the state machinery, are always saying, how can we fine-tune, stabilize this social order which we dominate and control, but also fine-tune it? So there has been efforts over the last couple of decades to switch the migrant labor pool from the system we've had for 50, 60 years, which is the border security pretends that they're stopping immigration, but they really know mass immigration is coming in undocumented, below ground, super exploited, super controlled. That's known as revolving door. Every time there's some tensions, mass deportation, let them come back in, super exploit them. But the other side of the business community and also the state elite has been saying we want the H-2A visa system. Now, that's a system which is euphemistically called guest worker system. And it's what we have in the Middle East. It's what we have in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf countries, where transnational migrant labor is recruited. Their passports are taken away when they come in. They live in slave-like conditions. When they're done with their employment, or if they don't want to go, sometimes they can't even get back home. But their employers can do whatever they want. And if they try any trouble whatsoever, any union organizing, whatever it is, they're sent right back out. That, I think, is called the kafala system. You may know better than me, Kareem. I think it's called the kafala system, that system of mobilizing super controlled, virtual enslaved, transnational migrant labor in the Middle Eastern countries, in the Gulf countries. And that's the system that sectors of the ruling class have wanted here. And the visa for that is called H-2A, which is a visa saying a specific employer recruits the person from Mexico, from Central America, from the Philippines, wherever it is, comes in, that person can only work for that employer under the conditions that employers determined. When the employment's done, you're back home. You never have residency rights or anything. So that's what we're moving towards here also, which is why Trump said, when some of the agricultural employers said, you're deporting all of our workers, the crops are dying, are in the field and no one can pick them. And Trump said, no, we're not going to deport them all. We want them. We are going to deport them. They can go back home. Then they can come back in legally. And what he's talking about is inaugurating this new system of guest workers. So all of these things are going on at once. The thing is, in our, going back to the discipline of sociology, there's no one monocausal explanation for all of this. It's an historic conjuncture of crisis, rapid change, rapid digitalization, intra-elite disputes and feuds, and they quite don't really know where they're headed with this as well. Rebellion from below, which is quite inchoate and chaotic, but still accumulating. So all of this is going on, and crisis is the subterranean, of all of this, the global crisis.
Well, William, if you can't put all of that into a multiple regression and find out the exact contributions of everything, you're just not doing science. I mean, if the world is a complex system and it doesn't yield to that sort of analysis, well, then so much the worse for the world. No, I'm kidding, of course. But
some of my colleagues would say that seriously.
Yeah, I mean, why don't these people ever read philosophy of science after Karl Popper? It's like they have a philosophy department in their own universities They could just walk down the street and take a class like Intro to Philosophy of Science and learn that the philosophers of science that they're relying on to justify their methodology have been completely disregarded for like 50 years in philosophy of science. But that they remain ignorant about it, and it works for them. So whatever. But I actually wanted to draw out some of the conflicts you talked about in this complex system. Even within the U.S. capitalist class, you've got people with very different interests. People, big agribusiness very much wants to bring in undocumented labor to super exploit.
Right.
Other segments of the capitalist class, I think, do recognize that blaming immigrants for economic woes is a very effective way of reducing, what would otherwise be perhaps a revolt against the current system. But I find it quite interesting like that. And then, of course, you have the base of Trumpism, of the Republican Party now, that sees in immigrants the explanation for why they're suffering. And it's such a simple explanation that you can say it in one sentence. They're coming here and taking your jobs. Whereas if any one of us wanted to try to explain the real reason for people suffering economically, it would take us a 3-hour lecture, So it has that advantage. But I see there's obviously a big tension within this coalition on the question of immigrant labor. And, I'd love to see an organized left argue and say, look, if you really want to end illegal immigration completely, like fail-safe way of ending illegal immigration that would be the cheapest way, you don't have to hire, spend $100 billion on new ICE agents to terrorize people around the country. All you need to do is give free legal representation to all undocumented workers and then impose, say, triple damages, quadruple, 10 times damages for any violation of labor law, but only for undocumented workers. You'd have a mass of young lawyers who might have been ambulance chasers will now become agricultural worker chasers, and there would be no illegal immigration after that. But of course, that proposal is never brought up by the Republican Party because that would get right to the heart of the split within the capitalist class that supports them. It's very frustrating for me to see, but what are your thoughts?
Right. Yeah. So you said something very important that I want to respond to. But first, just let me say my own position is that borders are not in the interests of the global working class. And it's in the interest of transnational capital that is able to use borders because transnational capital has no borders. Zips around the world with no obstacles whatsoever. And workers are locked into nation states as population containment zones. And those are conditions which will really allow transnational capital, or what I call the transnational capitalist class, to optimize the conditions for control and exploitation around the world. But that's something else which we can come back to. You said something extremely important, which is different capitalist groups have different interests with regard to immigrant labor. And I want to follow up on that by introducing my concept of militarized accumulation and accumulation by repression. I published a book in 2020 titled The Global Police State, and that's when I developed these concepts. And what we have to see with immigrant labor, because it's so revealing to the global police state, is that repressing and persecuting immigrant labor is enormously profitable for an increasingly big and hegemonic bloc of capital, which is the hegemonic bloc of capital at this time, which brings together the giant tech corporations with the military-industrial complex, with transnational finance. The three of them come together for this new hegemonic bloc of capital. But the reason I'm saying all of this is because the war against immigrants is unbelievably profitable. Unbelievable. We have to remember that with the new Trump bill, they're going to duplicate the number of detention centers. So there's going to be some 200 prisons just for immigrants, and there's going to be able to hold tens and tens of thousands of immigrants. And they're all run by private corporations. The two biggest ones, well known, are Core Civic and Geo Group. And these corporations, every time one immigrant spends one night in their facilities, they get several $100s. So these are blocks of, and these two companies are traded on Wall Street. So anyone that has money all over the world, you can be an investor from Shanghai, an investor from Brazil, an investor from Germany, you can buy shares. And the shares skyrocketed when Trump won the elections for these corporations. So they want to have a war on immigrants in order to lock up immigrants. But it's not just that. When immigrants are deported, those flights are not U.S. government flights that take them wherever they're going. Those are private charter jets that the U.S. government pays the deportation, the companies that run those airlines. And also when immigrants have to register with the department that handles their immigrant status, they have to put an ankle bracelet on, and that's private money. And then, I mean, it goes on and on. Building this so-called war against U.S.-Mexico border wall. That wall is being built by private corporations, construction corporations, cement corporations, high-tech corporations, including Israeli corporations, did some of the major construction the last time there was a boom in that border construction wall. So what we see here is that the largest story here is that, and if you don't mind, if we have time, let me just for a moment take the story back to 2010, 2011. What happens then? There's an organization here called ALEC. It's called American Legislative Exchange Committee. And it's an organization that brings together the CEO of the 500 largest transnational corporations operating in the United States with state-level elected officials. Arizona, California, New York, the elected officials. They meet repeatedly throughout the year, but once a year they have a big meeting. And it's these meetings where the corporations draft legislation. They draft them in corporate boardrooms. Then they bring this legislation to the ALEC annual meetings, and they say, this is the legislation we want you state legislatures to take back to your individual states and pass. So Core Civic, that used to be called Corrections Corporation of America, drafted legislation called SB State Bill 1070 in the year 2011 and brought that to the ALEC meeting, which was held in the state of Colorado, and said to the governor, Janet, I forgot her full name, and the governor's lieutenant governor of Arizona, please take this piece of legislation, which is calling for the criminalization of immigrants, of undocumented immigrants, and a massive campaign against them. Take this back to Arizona and have it passed. They brought it back. Now, of course, both of those people, the governor and lieutenant governor, they were shareholders of Corrections Corporation of America. They passed that legislation. That sparked massive protest all over the United States, but it also marked a qualitative new stage in the war against immigrants, where we see crystal clear, how waging the war against immigrants is enormously profitable for capital at a time of stagnation in the global economy, declining rates of profit. And so there's copycat laws spread all over the United States. That's where you really get this. The last 14, 15 years, Trump is just the culmination of it all. But there's another dimension here. If a sector of the capitalist class needs a war against immigrants in order to make profit, they might be nice people, and if you have a beer with them, they might say, I have nothing against immigrants. They're perfectly nice people. But the way they make profit, the way they accumulate capital is to persecute immigrants. In order for them to do that, they need to whip up the cultural and the ideological and the political environment of nativism and xenophobia and anti-immigrant racism. So they become agents to change the ideological system. And this is like, you have to see this big picture. Now, let me conclude. So I know I talk too much. I'm a professor. That's you guys are too. So you know that problem. But I want to conclude by saying
Don't worry. Keep going.
Okay, thank you. So this war on immigrants is one example of the larger story, which is how the whole global economy is becoming incredibly militarized, how transnational systems of warfare, social control, and repression are moving to the center stage of the whole global economy, all of these dimensions. So Trump's forcing Western NATO to increase the military budget from 2 to 5%. He just passed $1 trillion military budget, unheard of. So all over the world, war, conflict, repression are becoming privatized and profitable, and they're sustaining a global economy which is mirrored in stagnation.
So if I may link it a little bit further than than just Ukraine. We on this channel we spend a lot of time on the genocide in Palestine, and we talk a lot with people from all walks of life, academics, Palestinians themselves, etc. If you would consider what you've just been telling us, about how there is an attack on the working class, a remilitarization, also internationally, how would you link that? And would you link that to what is going on in Palestine right now?
Goes to the very core of everything we've been discussing, the very core. So let's start by saying that, well, to pick up where we left off in the last question. So the genocide in Gaza is, first of all, it's enormously profitable in multiple senses. So something happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. That was a disaster for the Russian people, disaster for the Ukrainian people, disaster for us people working classes all around the world. But the transnational capitalist class didn't look at it like that. They looked at it and said, incredible, this is just what we want. And that's why there was a spokeswoman for all of the defense contractors in the United States, which are themselves, by the way, those corporations are transnational, like Boeing and Raytheon. They're US based, but there's investors from all over the world. But she said, a couple months after the invasion, she said, look, for us, happy days are here again. And that's an exact quote. Happy days are here again. So a boost in profits. So we look at the Ukraine, see that disaster, they look at it and they salivate with more profits. Now, what happened when Israel started its genocide in late 2023? A Goldman Sachs executive official said, this is going to be great for our portfolio because there's enormous profit to be made. And who's making all of that profit with this? Well, it's the high-tech corporations, which are, again, the hegemonic fraction of transnational capital on a world scale. We speak about Palantir, and we speak about this being a digitalized genocide, completely artificial intelligence-driven genocide. Actually, I have this quote right in front of me. The Israeli general said it's really like a data-driven mass assassination factory. But that's one part of the story. The other part of how this is militarized accumulation and how this is how genocide itself becomes profitable and necessary for global capitalism is we have to expand the analysis. Again, global capitalism has been stagnant. The rate of profit has been declining for several decades now, and stagnation really set in after 2008. There was a slight recovery, but you really have extremely sluggish growth and with problems of capital accumulation. And so before October of 2023, the big transnational corporate conglomerates were looking around the world and saying the biggest place we have to expand right now is the Middle East. And in fact, you know that Davos is where the meeting of the World Economic Forum is. Well, there's a parallel meeting also organized by the World Economic Forum called Davos in the Desert. And Davos in the Desert took place in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, right before the Hamas attack that then led to the genocide. And in that meeting, they were saying we're massively going to expand. That is, transnational capitalists are massively going to expand in the Middle East. This is where we have growth potential, and that was all going to be dependent upon the normalization of Saudi relations with Israel. And the Saudi Arabia was just about to normalize its relations with Israel, which would create the political conditions for a massive inflow of capital and profit making in the Middle East. All that was put on hold with Hamas and with the genocide. But here is the thing. Israel has always been the gateway for starting with the West, but now all of transnational capital to enter into the Middle East and to expand in the Middle East. And that gateway has a problem, and the problem is called the Palestinians. And so the problem has to be resolved to have a true boom of globalized capitalism in the Middle East. And there's something else going on here, which now links, we were talking about earlier about this war on immigrants in the United States. The exact parallel, we have to identify something. Over the last couple of decades, all around the world, capitalist groups have created this new system of transnational migrant labor recruitment. So after the first intifada was the late 1980s into the early 1990s, the second intifada was 2000, 2001, right around there. And after the second intifada, Israel changed its strategy. It said, we're not going to use Palestinian labor anymore because for all those years, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians left Gaza, left the West Bank to go and work on plantations, in construction, in the dirty work that the Latino immigrants do here in the United States. And so Israel said, we're going to switch to transnational migrant labor and began to recruit labor from China, from the Philippines, from Sri Lanka, from India, from Ethiopia, from Kenya, from Eastern Europe. And so increasingly, Palestinians become what I call surplus humanity, meaning that capital does not need to exploit their labor. They're just redundant, surplus. You just have to get rid of them. And so really the genocide against the Palestinians of Gaza is surplus humanity, serves no use for global capitalism. And Israel is doing the dirty work of global capitalism by trying to get rid of the Gazan population and then move into there's oil, there's gas, there's beachfront property, but there's also clean up the area for a gateway for transnational capitalist expansion in the Middle East. So that's what I call that the Gaza option, the extermination option. So what do the ruling classes worldwide do with surplus humanity, which is now 2 billion people and growing? As we automate more and more, increasingly workers are going to be redundant and surplus. So the ruling groups have to say, how do you contain and control this massive surplus humanity? The Gaza option is outright genocide, extermination. The Salvadoran option is mass incarceration. I want to say something about this because now with Trump, everyone knows the Salvadoran dungeon, known as SECOT, Center for the Confinement of Terrorism. And there's 40,000 people locked up there. But what people don't know is that that was opened in 2023. And when it was opened, other countries around the world said, this is great. We should create these mega prisons. And Sri Lanka announced one which is going to hold 60,000. Thailand, China, Turkey, Egypt, all over the world, governments started announcing they're going to make the mega prisons after the Salvadoran model. So the second strategy that the ruling groups have to contain and control surplus humanity is the Salvadoran option, mass incarceration. And that also becomes profitable. That's part of militarized accumulation by repression. That also becomes wildly profitable. So that's the second option, how the ruling groups deal with surplus humanity, all symbolized by Palestine there. The third option, I'll conclude with this, is what I call the abandonment or the Sudan option, which is you have a population which is just standing in the way. You're not going to lock them up in mass incarceration. You don't need to commit genocide against them. Just leave them abandoned and they'll die, whatever it is, of starvation or whatever. So we have here in the United States, 100,000 people die of opiate overdose every year. And these are poor, devastated rural communities. There's no industry. There's all the agriculture semi-mechanized or doesn't exist there. And so there's this surplus population in the rural areas in the United States, and they're largely white, right? They're, and so, and they're dying by, there's now millions over the last decade or so, millions that have died from, so that's the third option, the abandonment, or I say the Sudan option, because the same thing in Sudan, there's two factions fighting each other for control over resources and territory, backed by different international groups. Populations displaced, gets in the way, just let them die of hunger.
Yeah, I wanted to get at some point to your ideas about a kind of constructive way out of this. They would call it a clusterfuck in the Marines or the U.S. military. But maybe this question will provide an opening, even though it seems like it is dragging us further down into the realm of pessimism. So you've described the kind of complex system that is the global political economic system up to this point. And now that our ruling class has basically dropped even their verbal commitment to addressing the ecological crisis, and now they've adopted what they call climate realism, but which really is climate crackpot realism. The idea that we'll just keep drilling, we'll keep burning. We need more energy for AI anyway, and plus there's the Ukraine war, etc. So we'll just keep on with business as usual and hope that at some point somebody invents some amazing, miraculous device that saves us. So most likely then we're going to just keep driving straight on into the ecological crisis. And then if the analyses of the effects of that are correct, and of course, you start off on the first order effects that are relevant for humans, droughts, massive floods, natural disasters, superstorms, etc. That then, and this is where the US Pentagon has actually done useful research, looking more at the second order effects. So then the second order effects are going to be famines, massive spikes in food prices, mass migrations. And there's no reason not to believe that that's going to cause greater and greater political tensions that will likely lead to more wars. You can easily imagine, millions of refugees going across any number of borders, India, Pakistan, whatever. In Europe, we already saw over the past decade or so the crazy political reactions that can come out of increased migration. So we're basically heading towards a more violent likely world that you can already start to see some similarities with what you've described in these three options for how to deal with a surplus population, and we're heading very much in that direction. This is kind of an unfair question, but can you first kind of incorporate the medium term outlook given the ecological crisis, and then if you can also point to the areas of opportunity in that kind of chaos that we have every reason to expect, about potential ways that we can emerge with a more civilized world.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic question. Well, it's more than a question. You've laid out some absolutely critical things there. So let me first say something about. I've been referencing the crisis of global capitalism, but I haven't really said anything about it. So let me say that everything looks dismal from what we've discussed so far, but it's not. It's hard to be optimistic, but I'm still staying optimistic. And part of the reason is that the global rebellion is already well underway and accumulating, picking up its impact. And I'll speak about that in just a minute. The other reason I have optimism is also because this system is so internally contradictory. It's going to collapse in on its own weight. Of course, it's going to take humanity down with it if we let it. So that's what we have to avoid. But this crisis is simply unprecedented. I have a new book coming out in 1 month, and I just mentioned the title because it really says a lot of it. Epical Crisis, the Exhaustion of Global Capitalism. So I see that there's four dimensions that the system itself, the ruling classes, cannot resolve. One is the economic dimension that we've been discussing, what we technically call overaccumulation, meaning that the system has accumulated so much enormous capital that it can't continue to reinvest, and the system stagnates economically. That's the structural dimension. But then there's the political dimension of this crisis, in that the system faces a crisis of state legitimacy. People don't see the system around the world. They don't see the system as legitimate. They don't see their governments as legitimate. There's a crisis of hegemony. There's a collapse of the international order. So that's the political dimensions of the crisis. And this is this got very underreported. This is Cato Institute, which is this right-wing libertarian institute here in the United States. They conducted a poll recently, and this is shocking but optimistic results. The poll showed that, I'm reading right from it, 62% of Americans aged 18 to 29 say they hold a favorable view of socialism. And 34% say they hold a favorable view of communism. So here's the younger generation, the majority, almost 7 out of every 10 are saying, we don't want this capitalist system. That is a crisis of legitimacy for the system, and that's spreading all around the world. The third dimension of the crisis is what we discussed also, is a crisis of what we call technically social reproduction. That increasingly majority of humanity cannot survive, is locked out. Just as you pointed out, there's going to be 1 billion climate refugees by 2050, or even earlier than that. So the latest data. So the more that people are locked out and the more that they cannot socially reproduce, the more they rebel against the system and feed the internal contradictions of the system. And before I get to the fourth, which is the ecological dimension. So you laid out the scenario correctly, that this mass migration from the Middle East in the post-2011 Arab Spring, and of course from North Africa, immigrants coming into the European Union, not because they love it there, but because that's where resources and wealth are concentrated because of history of colonialism. We know that. And then we saw the reaction. However, inside the West, the European Union, inside the rich countries, inside the United States, increasingly that working class is itself collapsing. That's how we started the interview. Their living standards and ability to socially reproduce is also collapsing. So that nativist rebellions against immigrants cannot continue to be an effective tool of the ruling classes. It's too contradictory. It doesn't explain why working classes, indigenous, European origin working classes are also there collapsing. And then so that's the fourth dimension. Also is the limits to the biosphere. So global capitalism is reaching the limits to its own reproduction, especially with the biospheric limits, with the ecological limits. So that's this that's what the ruling groups called, like in the 3 years ago, they report the polycrisis of global capitalism. So I want to then shift to what you're really getting at, which how do we see in the midterm, if this system continues, it will collapse on its own by the next century. I mean, we're in 2025. It can't go another couple of generations. It's just too internally contradictory. The big question then is not, will global capitalism collapse? It is, we from below, are we able to overthrow it or let it collapse in on itself and survive and build a new human-based world order? And while I can't predict what's going to happen in 3, 4 decades, 5 decades from now, and it's very scary but very good docudrama, because it's called a science fiction, but it's also half documentary. You can stream it on Amazon, called 2073, and it's definitely worth seeing. But so I want to conclude by saying this rebellion underway. We have to remember that the ruling groups are being reactive. They're reacting to their own crisis. They're reacting to our struggles from below. So may I read one thing and then about India? Take the example of India. On the one hand, India, you have a really neo-fascist regime using Muslims in the same way that Trump is using immigrants. You have extreme inequality. You have a whole lot of repression. You have fascist ideology, Hindu nationalist ideology. And then you have the ruling groups in India, and they're ensconced in. So this is just a few quotes from this article in a very recent issue, the second to last issue of The Economist. I'll just turn my light on higher here for a moment. It explains the ruling groups in India used to want to leave India because you had to live in underdevelopment. Now they don't need to because you have the first world inside the third world. Just like in the United States, you have the third world inside the first world. So the article says these days the Indian, they don't want to leave. They're happy staying there. Big Indian metropolises see a rise and cluster of awesome towers and names such as Imperia, Opulus, and Pinnacle. Inside our world is a world of quiet luxury, gyms with personal trainers, multiple pools and spas, private cinemas, acres of gardens, and to satisfy residents' metaphysical needs, meditation areas and temples. India can be a difficult place to live with its pollution and noise and chaos, but now they don't want to leave. The roughly $850,000 millionaires want to stay put. And then it goes on, to explain this, how these enclaves crop up. Now, what's the other side? The reason I was getting into that is that's one future. And you're saying, what does it look like in the midterm? It's fortress world, right? These fortresses of the privileged clustered all around the world. And outside of that is mass misery and destruction and starvation and genocide and warfare. But that's contradictory, as I read with that quote. Now, what happened in India 2 weeks before that article came out in The Economist? A general strike of 250 million workers. 250 million, think that through. You had agricultural workers, you had small farmers, you had miners, you had transport workers, you had the port workers, you had the civil servants, you had industrial workers, you had the informal workers, you have fisher people, you have all the domestic workers, men and women who work in people's homes. 250 million people out of a country of 1.1 billion. That's 1 out of every 4 participated in a general strike. So that really shows the potential and the mass boiling rage against this system. Our challenge is, how do we organize and how do we have a coherent left that can articulate all of these struggles around the world and all of these sectoral struggles, articulated into an emancipatory project from below without controlling that mobilization from below? That's the big challenge of the 21st century left, which has not been able really to, unfortunately, renew itself yet.
Yeah, I mean, arguably it failed in the 20th century as well, at least in the West, where it was supposed to have successful socialist revolutions, thereby obviating the need for, your Chinas, your Vietnams, your Cubas to reinvent the wheel on their own, excluded from the most advanced technology. But I share your hope that we get organized and powerful and serious this century, because this is really the only shot we have.
Yeah, and I would say also, I think we have such an uphill battle talking about the whole digital space, and you were talking about Palantir and all that kind of stuff. They have such a stranglehold over our psychology in that sense, from algorithms to the way the news is presented, etc., etc. So if you had any, and I know this is a very difficult question, we're almost at the hour, so maybe we can try and end with a bit of a more positive note. Feel free to say you have no answer, because that's also very logical. If you would have any advice for us, the working class, the simple people around the world, the proletariat, what kind of concrete steps would you suggest should we take to try and fight this behemoth of evil, I would like to say, when we talk about capitalism?
Yeah. Well, I have comments. I don't know if it's advice, because I think that workers and people that are engaged in all of these struggles around the world, they know the situation they face, and they're doing a good job in rebellion. The problem is, I think some key terms here. One is transnationalizing these struggles, the local and national struggles, because capital is transnational and we need a transnational response. Um, a, a second is key word here is I used it already is articulation. So you get a situation where here in the United States there's every imaginable struggle, every imaginable sector, from feminism to anti-racist struggle to environmental social movements to indigenous movements. I mean, to new attempts at unionizing and more formal worker struggles. And so I think we need to think about how do you articulate all these different fronts of struggle. I want to say something else also, and it's that well, you guys are in an alternative media, right? This alternative podcast, but you would never know by following mainstream media that there's all the rebellions going on around the world. I mean, I mentioned India, but as we just a few weeks ago was the uprising in Kenya. And as we speak, there's uprisings in Panama, really mass rebellions in Panama. We could go all around the world and identify all of these rebellions, all of these struggles. And in fact, in the article which you mentioned, Karen, that we started with, I think it's in that article, I quoted the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace that has what they call a global protest tracker. And that tracker shows this incredible proliferation of struggles and mass protests around the world. It's just that it's one, the mainstream media doesn't cover it. And secondly, they're not articulated. They're not coherent. They explode and then they die down temporarily and then people get outraged again and explode again. But another thing that we really need to think about is reconceptualizing unions, because the most important working class organization around the world is always going to be unions. The proletariat is the biggest class in world history. The global proletariat's about 3.5 billion strong now. There's still significant peasant classes, which should be aligned, at least poor peasants, with workers, of course, as an age-old, understanding. But the biggest class in history is the global proletariat. And our way of organizing ourselves are unions. But we used to have a conception of unions as for people that have full-time, year-round work. And that's a problem because increasingly either you're surplus, you're just unstructurally unemployed, or you're in the informal economy, or if you are employed, you have precarious employment, all these new types of contract labor and part-time labor and temporary labor and digital ghost labor. And so we need a new way of thinking about unions. Unions are any organizational form for organizing proletarians to come together and to struggle. And that means a lot of different things because the classical union workers' instrument is to withdraw your labor. You go on strike so you're not allowing yourself to be exploited by the factory or the enterprise until you get your demands met. That's fine if you have full-time work, and you can do that. You can withdraw your labor. But for those proletarians that don't have work, the trick is, how do you disrupt the system from its normal functioning? As I put it recently in another interview, how can you throw sand in the gas tank of global capitalism, right? Rather than the driver of global capitalism, which are workers driving it, stop driving it. That's that too. So we need to reconceptualize what it means for the global proletariat to organize itself and struggle under these new conditions of 21st century globalized capitalism in crisis. And I don't have the answers to that, but I have this perspective, which I think we need that perspective, the big picture perspective, to help workers and oppressed people in organizing themselves to struggle.
Yeah. And I would just add, on top of all of the proliferation of unions that cover even marginally employed, precariously employed people, there also needs to be unity and coordination, which essentially means less freedom for an individual union. Like, you're a union working security guard for GeoCorp or Core Civic, whatever the hell they call themselves now. You might have to lose out, but if you have unity, you can find ways to help people that lose out when we as a collective decide this area of the economy needs to end or be transformed into something else.
Exactly. Yeah. When globalization started, 1970s to 1980s, there was a lot of talk about organizing industrial unions across borders, which is extremely important. Meaning that if you're an auto worker in the United States, your union is not U.S. auto workers, but you're organizing also with Mexican and Canadian auto workers and increasingly beyond. That's still important, but that was this discussion in the late 20th century. Now it's, I think, what you're saying is that unionizing at every level, students should be unionizing, unemployed should be unionizing, and exactly that we need to think in terms of the class and what are the weak points and the trigger points and the most urgent struggles at a particular moment. And yes, less individual direct economic gain and more development of transnational proletarian class power. Absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, but we are just so successfully atomized in our societies with our smartphones and the whole digitalization of our world. It's just so difficult to get people to get some solidarity with each other. Not because human beings are just inherently individualistic. We're really not. It's just that our
Right.
societies are so good at conditioning us into that mindset since we are a little child, especially in the West. In our hyper individualistic consumerist societies. It's just
Yeah.
such a difficult struggle.
Yeah.
I don't know, from a psychological and also sociological point of view.
Yeah, I agree. And social media and it's intentional. The corporations, the tech and social media corporations know what they're doing. I mean, Meta knows exactly what it's doing. They've made that worse, that people exist in these digitalized silos. And even when they think they're doing activism, it's not really. And has devastating, you guys are psychologists. You know the devastating effect that these technologies have on young people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's funny that you said about that young people and people cannot go to mainstream media to get that information that we do on independent media. I was just teaching a group of international exchange students that come every year in the summer to our university to see how that everything goes here in Hong Kong, China. And I actually had students in my class from France, from Canada, who said that they were following our channel. So I was like, wow. So it's becoming well known among the young generation internationally. So I thought that is a very good sign. Well, I guess we have to wrap it up here. We're at the hour now, William. This was really excellent. I must admit that I really loved this. And we also, when you said, okay, the first thing you said is we have to internationalize the struggle. We have a regular professor coming on our show. He's from the University of Houston. He's called Professor Gerald Horn. And he always says,
yeah.
So he's often on our channel. He always says the same. You must internationalize the global struggle against capitalism. So that seems to be we all seem to have the same kind of mindset when it comes to this. And I'm going to be a little bit bold. I hope we can invite you again, William, because I think we have a lot to talk about. This was really, really good. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And of course, I would be very honored to come back at some point in the future.
Great. We'll look forward to it then. All right. Well, it was great talking with you.
Same here.
Keep surviving in California. Hopefully you can educate some of your, let's say, philosophy of science ignorant colleagues.
Working on it.
All right. Thank you, William, and see you next time.
Okay. Take care. Bye.
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 حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي انا حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي تكتيكي تكتيكي